I'm going to talk about the deep structure of the music in Prometheus Bound, and in particular, in the technical sense, I'm going to talk about two 7-beat rhythms which recur throughout. There's a 7/8 rhythm, which is the rhythm of the gadfly theme, which is and so on. And that is a rhythm which is disruptive, which disrupts the steady progression of the diatonic harmonies which make up the male music. But actually the male music itself relies on a 7/4 rhythm, which I want to talk about in some detail now. You find it at the very beginning of the opera, where fire is produced and there are these cello lines playing very long 7/4 scales. Now, just about everybody who has ever tried to learn an instrument in the Western tradition has spent a good deal of time playing scales. And what you find if you look in a scale book is you find this rather odd notation of the scales that you're supposed to learn, because they're written, usually, here's an example, they're written in 8th notes, and the 8th notes are grouped together like this, and there's maybe a quarter note to finish on. And what we see is that this is actually a defective notation, because to be correct, to be well formed, a musical passage, even the simplest one, should have a time signature and bar lines. However, we can see why that is not the case with scales, because if we divide the scales up according to the groups suggested by the 8th note notation, for example, we find that this offends against what we can call harmonic rhythm, because clearly the harmonic note, if you like, of the scale is the first note that you play. The tonic of the scale, arguably the root of a chord with which it's harmonized, and the note that gives its name to the scale, you know, D flat major, F minor, whatever it is. And if we impose on this scale, superimpose, let's say, a 4-beat rhythm as suggested by the notation, we find that the stress that this implies, because it implies that there's a beat, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, this strong beat is not going to correspond with the structure of the scale. So one way that this can be overcome is actually by doubling the note at the octave. And this is something that people do spontaneously when they play scales, because if you double the note at the octave, then you find that you do have, in fact, two 4-beat groups, 4 note groups, and so that you can then have 8 beats in a bar, and you can play a scale which corresponds to the simplest form of harmonic rhythm, which is where you have the same chord, the tonic, the chord on the tonic of the scale that you're playing, repeated once per bar, and it all harmonizes. If you don't do that, however, and it's not the correct way to play scales, your teacher will stop you from doing that, or should do anyway. You find that you can't do that, and so people spend hours then practicing to avoid exactly that, so that they play the scale evenly with the same stress on every note is the idea, so that the only note which is stressed in fact is the tonic, which is, this stress is marked by the fact that when you return to the tonic at the end, you play it for a longer time, and in fact you would, with a sort of fermata on it, you'd extend that note a bit naturally. Now, I hope that's all clear to everyone, because I was thinking about this harmonic rhythm, and it suddenly occurred to me that, in fact, there is another solution to this. There is a way to notate these scales correctly, to correspond to the way that they are, in fact, played. And that is to notate them in 7/8 time. Because if you notate them in 7/8 time, then you play the scale. Here's an ascending F major scale. You play once through the bar, and you get to the strong beat for the second bar, the beginning of the descending scale. And then at the end of that, you play the tonic again, which again falls on the strong beat of the bar. So listen to that again. And what we find is that this corresponds to the way that people do in fact play scales. This is the correct notation for playing scales. It doesn't change the way that the scale is played naturally at all, but it's an improvement on the traditional notation for the scales. And it shows us the actual structure, the rhythmic structure, or what we could call the harmonic rhythmic structure, the structure of the harmonic rhythm of the scale, which is a 4-beat rhythmic group and a 3-beat rhythmic group, but they overlap, so that the 3-beat rhythmic group at the end could be seen as a 4-beat group which overlaps, so that the last beat of that 4-beat group is also simultaneously the first beat of the descending scale, and that again corresponds to the actual practice of playing these scales. This is how we hear them, and this is how we play them. Now, the scale, the major scale, is not just something invented, it's a natural object. It corresponds to physical relationships between pitches, and it was progressively discovered over centuries in art music through plain chant, through liturgical music, which gradually established the notes one by one. They actually started on one note, and then they added another note in chanting the liturgy, the Latin liturgy of the church, and then another note, and so on, until eventually they arrived at the gamut, which is the familiar major scale that we use today. And I think it's very important to realize that this scale is not just a melodic or harmonic object, but it's also a rhythmic object. And if we consider that it's composed of a 4-beat group and a 3-beat group, I think we can go even further, and we can say that that division into what we could call a major and a minor rhythmic group, a 4-beat group and a 3-beat group, is itself the motor for the composed music of the centuries, where the 4-beat group and the 3-beat group are the main components of music. I don't know what percentage, 80%, 90% of composed music is either in 4/4 or 3/4 or some simple variant of that. And so I think that there's a sort of process whereby the attempt to play this basic 7/8 rhythm in 4 or in 3 beats generates melody, generates cadences, generates music, generates tunes, generates rhythms. And the extraordinary fact is that for perhaps 500 years, millions of musicians have, without realizing it, been assiduously practicing, sometimes for hours a day, for the more dedicated. They've been practicing playing in 7/8 or 7/4, you could call it 7/4 time. I don't think there's any particular justification for seeing it as an 8th note rhythm. That's just a notational convention. And in Prometheus Bound, I've chosen to stick to a 7/4 format for these male chords, because the 7/8 is already used for a different purpose. But that's the story of the 7-beat scale.